Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge those responsible for this series. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the president himself, Dr. George Dennison, for his commitment to and support of a series that, in my judgment, has transformed UM into such a vibrant intellectual institution. Please, thank you. I also want to acknowledge the efforts of my friend and colleague, Dr. Richard Drake, who has worked tirelessly to put this program together. Dr. Drake has become adept at attracting such high caliber speakers we've seen in the last 3 years. Thank you, Dr. Drake, for your efforts. Last but not the least, I'd like to acknowledge Michelle Shaughnessy. Michelle has been Dr. Drake's strong, right arm in, organizing this series in the last years. And unfortunately, she's leaving us for a new job at St. Patrick's Hospital. We will miss her devotion to the series and to the university. We wish you all the best in your new occupation. Thank you, Michelle. It's become almost a cliche to begin an introduction of this nature with the phrase, "It's indeed a honor." Well, let me say that this is one occasion where this is really not a cliche, because I'm here to introduce someone whose really intellectual achievements and accomplishments actually is very much in evidence. Someone whose scholarship has influenced my own intellectual upbringing, Professor Orlando Patterson of Harvard University. I first met Professor Patterson as a young graduate student in Canada, my very first year in graduate school. It was at Waterloo, University of Waterloo, Canada. I still remember your epic encounter with the late indomitable Walter Rodney. Your criticism of his paper on slavery and underdevelopment left many of us young graduate students mesmerized. And it reminded me of an epic African proverb which says, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that pays the price. And many of us actually went home mesmerized. Thank you. We are indeed fortunate to have with us here Professor Patterson, the John Cowles Professor, Cowles Professor of Sociology, Harvard University. He received his PhD in sociology from the London School of Economics in 1965. After faculty appointments at the London School of Economics and the University of the West Indies, he moved to Harvard in 1969 and 1970 and was appointed a professor the following year. His dissertation, The Sociology of Slavery, Jamaica, 1865 to 1838, was published in 1967. From this source, his academic interests moved in 3 main directions: the comparative study of slavery aimed at an understanding of the power and its limit on both the personal and systemic levels, the study of its antithesis, freedom, and the study of socioeconomic underdevelopment with special reference to Jamaica and the Caribbean Basin. His book, Slavery and Social Debt, a comparative study, was published by Harvard in 1982. Professor Patterson explored the problems of underdevelopment in numerous publications on the Caribbean and in many policy-oriented reports that he prepared for the government of Jamaica when he served as a special advisor for Prime Minister Michael Manley for social policy and development between 1972 and 1980. The convergence of his primary interests led naturally to an exploration of the problems of ethnicity, which resulted in the publication of Ethnic Chauvinism, the Reactionary Impulse in 1977. His study of slavery and domination prompted interest in and study of the nature and development of the shadow concept, freedom. In June of 1991, he published the first of 2 volumes, Historical Sociology of Freedom, entitled Freedom, Freedom in the Making of the Western Culture. He is presently completing the second volume of Freedom, dealing with the modern world. At the same time, Professor Patterson is shifting his focus to contemporary America with special emphasis on the intersecting problems of race, immigration and multiculturalism. He has published already the first 2 volumes of a trilogy in this area. First, The Ordeal of Integration, Progress and Resentment in America's Ritual Crisis, and Rituals of Blood, The Consequences of Slavery in 2 American Centuries. These books are available. In fact, he will be doing a book signing after the lecture outside the hall here. Professor Patterson has won numerous awards, among them the Distinguished Contribution to Scholarship Award of the American Sociological Association in 1983, also known as the Sorkin Award. Co-winner of the Ralph Bunche Award of the American Political Association for the best scholarly work on the subject of pluralism. The National Book Award in Nonfiction for the Volume 1 of Freedom in 1991, and the Walter Channing Cabot Faculty Prize in Harvard, which he won twice in 1983 and in 1997. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Honors W. Burgess Fellow, American Academy of Political and Social Sciences. Please join me in welcoming undoubtedly one of the most accomplished and distinguished intellectuals of this nation.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. Let me say again what a pleasure it is to be here and to have been offered the opportunity to visit a part of the country which I should have known about much earlier than this. But it's better late than never. I'm glad to be here. Let me begin with a paradox. We call the American paradox. Freedom, now more than ever, remains a profoundly held belief among Americans. We're truly the land of the free. Whether we're the home of the brave is another matter. But we are the land of the free, as I hope to show. President Bush, in his last State of the Union address, reaffirmed America's role as the leader of the free world with renewed vigor, you'll recall. Promoting freedom globally is now the centerpiece of America's foreign policy. And yet, America now faces grave threats to its freedom. The Patriot Act severely threatens civil liberties. Democracy is gravely compromised by both short-term and more chronic institutional developments, as I hope to discuss later. International watchdog agencies such as Amnesty International have cited the nation for its record on civil liberties. It's quite an embarrassment, especially coming the very year in which we've declared that our centerpiece of our foreign policy is to spread freedom in the world. Freedom House is a domestic and right of center organization which does an annual sort of record of where countries are in terms of freedom, sort of which it grades on a 1 to 7 basis. And fair disclosure, I was on the board of that organization until a few years ago. Found it necessary to reduce the annual freedom score of America. Even very conservative domestic organizations such as the Cato Institute, arguably one of the most conservative think tanks in the nation, has expressed growing concern about recent developments. How do we explain this paradox? My argument, the argument I hope to present tonight, is that there are really 2 cultures of freedom in America. There's a formal public freedom, the ones you're familiar with, the ones you learn in school, in civics classes, and so on, the ones we live by, which still, thank God, inform our major institution. It's our constitutionally protected civil liberties, It's highly institutionalized in the legal and political system. There's an active civil society, although increasingly elite-dominated. We have a well-established political system with a division of powers. But along with this is another tradition of freedom, a highly privatized conception and experience of freedom by Americans. And this tradition is increasingly uncoupled from the political process, and indeed is in many ways skeptical of the formal process. Over the past several years, I've been examining this other system of freedom. I sometimes refer to it as ordinary liberties. It's the freedom which ordinary Americans, or I should say lay Americans actually, believe in and live by. I've used various sources, primary and secondary historical sources, survey data, some of which I'll report on tonight, my own national survey, just done for me by NORC, conducted in 2000, reanalysis of survey data from other data archives and freedom. Interview data, using both conventional interview techniques and a special kind of interviewing, ZMET interviewing, which I'll talk about later today. I also draw on newspaper accounts, found data I call it, found ethnographies, reports of journalists of Americans doing freedom. More on that later. Those are the sources I've been examining for the past 5 or so years to get to a better understanding of what Americans really mean by freedom. So let me first report on the survey data. The advantage of surveys, of course, especially ones conducted by such reputable organization as NORC, is that you get a representative sample of what Americans think and believe. The disadvantage is that you don't get much depth. I've tried to combine two methods. I'll present you the representative sample and its results, and then I'll move to the in-depth analysis later on. So here are some highlights from what I've found. We ask Americans how much freedom do they think they have. And Americans think they have a great deal of freedom, as you can see. Well over 70% of Americans think they have a great degree of freedom. In fact, it's more like 80%. And the interesting thing here in this graph is how little difference there is between different groups of Americans. Whites, blacks, other Americans, men and women, profile is very similar. Americans are convinced that they are the land of the free, and they think they have a lot of freedom. And that's good. We asked them what their perceptions are of the changes in the level of freedom, of their own freedom. Again, there's a great deal of difference. There are some subtle differences, mainly relating to gender. One of the interesting things is that African American women have the highest scores in terms of the level of changes in their own freedom, and that in many ways reflects the reality. Two of the most powerful women in the nation today are black women. On the political front, Condoleezza Rice, and of course the phenomenal Oprah Winfrey, without doubt the most powerful cultural figure in American history. Other than that, as you can see, there's a great many differences between the groups. Where things become interesting is when we ask Americans how much their perceptions of changes in the level of freedom among other people in the nation. And one of the interesting findings here is that Euro-American men seem to think that there is less freedom among others, not among themselves, than there is previously. All sort of subtle and interesting implications of that. Sociologists often are intrigued by the differences people give in answers to questions about what you think as opposed to what you think other people think. And many of us are of the view that what people say other people think is usually a better reflection of what they really think than what they say about what they think is happening to them. And it's perhaps interesting that among men, Euro-American men, there's a view that there's a perception that there's less changes. The other issue we explored nationally is the notions of freedom. We use a set of open-ended questions we simply ask Americans what is their view of freedom? What is freedom? What's most important? And as you can see, doing what I want is the most important view of freedom. Rights remain important. Choices, doing what I want, are the really critical factors. What is interesting about this graph, however, is what's not there. Very few Americans mention politics as being an important part of what constitutes freedom, or political participation. They mention citizenship, but that's more of the form of being an American and so on. But it really is quite striking. This is it was my first signal of something extraordinary. This is a classic national sample, over 1,500 people, and less than 10 of them mention anything to do with voting, with political acts, as being an important dimension of what they consider freedom. This, by the way, is very different from the responses you get in other countries, in other democracies, Western democracies. If you look at the Eurobarometer, for example, which does similar surveys, people do mention the fact that they vote, they have a right to vote. It's very important. I know this is quite striking. I wonder what's going on. We try to establish the degree to which we could cluster Americans, and after a great deal of statistical analysis, I guess one could say that there are three basic kinds of three clusters. They don't differ greatly, and it sort of reinforces what we saw earlier, that Americans are generally, at least from surveys, have very similar views about freedom. One cluster, the majority, about 51%, we call them the people who are gung-ho on freedom, the enthusiasts, emphasize doing what I want, the capacity to do things, a spiritual dimension, peace of mind, and so on, no government interference, very interesting. The poverty variable, okay, what this question asks is whether it's okay in a society for a very high level of inequality and poverty to exist, and whether this is compatible with freedom. As you can see, there are some misgivings about that on the part of this first cluster. There's general agreement among Americans on the free press issue. The question here is whether the press should be free and whether government should leave it alone. The second cluster, similar in many ways, except with respect to the poverty and its compatibility with freedom. And a third cluster, the smallest, which I guess would be seen as the more liberal, who are tend less to emphasize doing what I want, and emphasize peace as important, less emphasis on the absence of government. But one interesting thing to note about, I guess the most interesting thing is how little difference there is among Americans in their general views on freedom. I was very interested in exploring greater depth statistically what this conception of freedom is, doing what I want. What does it mean and how it varies? One point to note about this, by the way, and political philosophers should take note, is that among political theorists and among political scientists who study freedom, the general impression or the general view is that a negative conception of freedom prevails in the Western democracies, and especially among Americans, that freedom is essentially a negative thing, not being constrained and so on. I didn't find that. I found a very, very positive view of freedom among Americans, and this comes out in the later in-depth studies. This graph reports more detailed statistical analysis and tends to sort of tease out more some of the differences, that the odds of saying doing what I want is the central notion of freedom increase significantly if you're a man, and decreases significantly if you're a woman. Whites tend to be more inclined to emphasize this, blacks much less inclined to do so. Not as much regional variation as one would expect. Perhaps the biggest surprise in this finding is the fact that conservatives, being a conservative, reduces the odds of saying doing what I want. I found this genuinely surprising because I would have thought that this is the group who, thinking of New Hampshire, live free or die and all the rest of it, would be the group with which the odds would be greater, but it's not. And I guess one can partly explain this in terms of the growing emphasis on social, religious, and value factors among conservative. But it is a puzzle which I haven't yet quite resolved. Now, an interesting thing is that rights did not stand out as the most important factor, given the tremendous emphasis on it in the schools or colleges and public life. And in exploring it further, you notice some interesting differences. Women, unlike the earlier graph, the odds are much greater that if you're a woman, you emphasize rights as the important conception of freedom. For men, the odds are reduced significantly. It's not a surprise, somewhat dispiriting one, is the fact that being poor reduces the odds of emphasizing rights as an important category of freedom. The very strong emphasis there in the West comes mainly from the fact that a significant proportion of the Western population are immigrants, and immigrants tend to emphasize rights very strongly, especially coming from countries where rights are not emphasized. This is the aspect of freedom which they find most attractive in Americans. Explain, at least it's my explanation of why it is that the odds are so greatly increased of emphasizing rights if you're from the western part of the country. I don't know whether that includes Montana. I rather doubt it. Let's skip over this. The other thing I was interested in exploring in the survey, but got into far more details in the actual in-depth analysis, has to do with the main experiences associated with freedom. the earlier tables really reported on notions of freedom. What you learn in civics classes, what you read about in the newspapers, I guess. But we wanted to know what experiences people associate with freedom. And that's what I further explored in the other studies. Movement, one form or the other, was by far the most important experience. Americans love their cars. I mean, I sort of get responses like, the time I feel most free is when I'm driving in my pickup with Bruce Springsteen playing in full volume on the radio. The leisure, being disengaged from activities, and this reinforces what my colleague Robert Putnam has found, is not being involved. Although an equal number of Americans also state being engaged in some way as important. But the strong emphasis on movement is what comes out here. But note again, the political plays a relatively minor role, although somewhat greater than when talking about notions of freedom. So the main findings then from the survey data is that Americans have a very positive view of freedom. It emphasizes doing what one wants, being in control. It's critical, which is very significant, as I hinted earlier, given the view of political scientists that a negative conception is what the prevailing view. At politics, civic life, largely removed from the semantic field of freedom. And there's no relation between the somewhat privatized view of freedom and how people behave politically. I didn't show you the results here, but one rather startling finding was the fact that one claims that one is very, very free is negatively related to the extent to which one votes and voted in the last election. So, now, I'm primarily a historical sociologist. I do statistics because my colleagues do it, and Americans like it. I maintain a healthy level of skepticism about statistics. And what I want to talk about now is the kind of data which I find more persuasive. That is sitting down and talking at great length for several hours with people, a closer look at their beliefs. As I said, the kind of data I use here has to do with the interviews as well as analysis of newspaper accounts of freedom. There's no mistaking America's deep commitment to the idea of and belief in freedom. Absolutely none. Let me just very briefly touch on the research I've done on drawing on samples of 46 newspapers over the course of a year between mid-1999 and mid-2000, same year we did the survey. We looked at a total of 355 stories. This is a very interesting exercise. The newspaper is full of accounts of how Americans actually behave. I mean, journalists are amateur anthropologists. And the kind of data you get there is sort of found data. That is, this is not a sociologist or political scientist thrusting a microphone in front of people. This is a report on what they're actually doing. And this is very revealing. I don't have the time to go into all of this. I'll just mention one as a lead-in to what I wanted to really talk about tonight. Nothing better illustrates the American profound commitment to freedom than the kind of sacrifices which people will make for it. And one of the most moving stories I got from this analysis, the woman in Spokane, she was a very active woman, an attorney, enjoyed going to the gym, enjoyed driving her car, moving. And she developed Alzheimer's. And every month, there's some dreadful decision to give up one or other freedom. Until it came to the point where she and her husband had to decide whether she would continue driving to the gym or not. The gym was only about a half a mile away, another block. And they discussed it at great length. And they decided, no, she would not do this. That life wouldn't be worth living if she had to give up this last freedom. And she continued driving, and one day she was missing. And missing the whole evening. And the next day they found her in the park, which was just about around the corner from the gym, frozen to death. And there's a lot of soul searching about this. Should her husband have taken the paternalistic position and prevented her? I mean, in Europe, there's no doubt what people would have done, and some people were critical of this. But you know, her husband, they'd been married for over 50 years, and he said they talked about this. And it was a matter of freedom, and they weren't prepared to give that up. And he would do it again. This is just one account. There are many, many accounts in the newspapers at that time. I think nothing better illustrates this profound commitment to the idea of being free is the most important thing in life. And I have, as I said, hundreds of stories. This is one of over 300 stories of a similar nature, illustrating this profound commitment to this thing called freedom. But what exactly is it? We've gotten some notion of what Americans may mean from the survey, but that didn't satisfy me. I wanted to find out more. I wanted to find out what Americans thought freedom is. I wanted to find out what Americans believe and even what they believe without even knowing they believe. And there's a technique of doing this. The technique, known as Z-Med interviewing, is to use images to get at what people really mean by something. It's developed by a group of cognitive scientists led by Harvard Business School professor Jerry Zaltman. And one explores the hidden meanings of individuals, in my case, freedom. The technique, I should point out, was developed by a marketing expert to figure out what people really sort of mean when they drink Coca-Cola and things like that. And, it made the people millionaires, and so I figured it had to be effective. The idea here, which comes out of cognitive science, is that most of the things we really mean and communicate are least effectively communicated by words. In fact, in any interaction we have, words tend to provide the least amount of meaning. Meaning tends to be conveyed more by body language, and by various other kinds of signals. And images, it turns out, is a very powerful way, certainly far more powerful way of expressing one's feelings. And the technique is simply this, that before a week or so before we interview people, we tell them what we're going to talk to them about. And we ask them to gather images which express their feelings about this idea. In my case, find all the images you can which express your views about freedom, as you really understand it, and unfreedom, what makes you most unfree. And they turn up a week later to the interview with their stack of images. It's kind of like a reverse Rorschach test. In the Rorschach test, you bring these pre-designed images to the individual, and then you get them to free associate and interpret it. In this case, the interviewee brings the images to you, which they've discovered, and then you use it as a basis for free association. And it works wonderfully at getting at people. As I was explaining to some colleagues today, invariably in the middle of an interview, someone will say, "My God, did I say that?" And you know you've sort of moved to a deeper level. And I want to report some of this here this evening. Let's just get straight into some of the images which people use. By the way, this is a collage which we use at the end of the interview. These are all individual images. And each individual image is used as a basis for a long sort of discussion in the interview. And at the end, we ask people to form a collage. We photograph the images, and then around the computer they form the collage. And what you get from the collage, how they associate the images, is also very important. Let's start with a working class Euro-American. The image I want to look at here is the one of the surfboarder, and also the one to the far right, lower right, the ocean. So why did you choose this image for freedom? Because, like I say, I get angry and things are bothering me, and I go down to Castle Island on the water and just sit and relax. Sometimes I go down fishing and just sit and look over the water. I block everything out, anything that is bothering me, the family, whatever. I just block out everything and just relax and have a nice feeling of being on the water and looking at the sky. I just block people out. So we ask, what happens when you block people out? What does it do for you? It makes me feel good. No worries. I'm not worrying, I'm not angry for that time that I'm down there. I just go off by myself. I just don't think about anything, or I try not to. It's nice, and I'm relaxed. How do you get to that point? With all the pressure from people, I live in development. He explains this in a housing scheme. This is a working class South Boston man. I've been there 20 years, so I've seen a lot of people come and go, and you have to get away from them. You see them up and down the elevators, you go shopping, you want to know what you buy. They're looking at your bags. I get away from that, all that. This is a perfect example of freedom as being left alone, it's escape. It also, by the way, is a good example of the difference between men and women I've seen in these interviews. This individual gets angry not only with his family, making demands to socialize, but with living conditions. He feels the need to be away from it all. I have no examples from the hundreds of hours of interviews I've done of this from any of the women. Women also want relief from family responsibilities, but it's a temporary freedom from things they love to do. Their intense engagement with family makes temporary relief necessary, even though there's always, as one individual says, the little voices at the back of your head. We have no instance of women saying that they're angry with their families. I have more to say about that later on. This is from an upper middle class American. By the way, one of the advantages of doing collaborative work with a Harvard Business School professor is that I have the opportunity, which very few sociologists have been doing research, which is to interview upper middle class and upper class people from Fortune 500 companies. Okay, so this individual, I want to focus on the scheme. This is one of the things which this individual said makes her feel most free. She is a consultant in marketing. She points out, we asked, well, what's significant about this? She said, well, I think part of it is going somewhere where no one has gone. Having an expansive area in front of you and having the ability to go wherever you want. No limitations other than those you set upon yourself. She emphasizes control. You have all of that control yourself. Unless, of course, you get out of control while skilled and something else takes control. So what's the benefit of feeling control? It gives you the ability to go where you want to go. And because everyone likes to be in control of where they go. They don't want someone else telling them where to go. And that's one of the things, a lot of people, why that feeling of freedom is kind of disorienting, because you don't have someone else directing you. It's all up to you. This is another, let's say, upper middle class woman, and she emphasizes money, dancing, nudity, and her comments are extremely interesting. The picture of the bundle of $100 bills and having a very tight, nice body and being totally naked. They're very similar in my mind. My sensibility of these is their strong similarities, and I have to try and explain it to you, and she tried to explain it to us. For me, she says, personal freedom equals options. You take advantage of what options are right in front of me, she says. And we ask, is that related to being in control? I would think it has to do with control. It also has to do with the desire to have certain kinds of experiences. Where do you get control? You know? I don't think you get control. I think you take control or not. Taking control can create any number of outcomes. If you take control in a situation, there's a group of people, whenever there's a group of people, there's a unique dynamic, and she goes on at great length. And in the end, she said, essentially, freedom amounts to power, having power in interactions. Now, let's move down the class ladder to an African American, certainly not on the bottom of the class ladder. It's a man who works as the equivalent of an administrative assistant in a Harvard medical system. And he's unhappy with his job situation. This is his idea of freedom. This is a hip hop artist doing his thing. I'm looking at a picture. He's here. It's a hip hop artist, producer, and he's in the studio, he says. It looks like he's doing some engineering with little thingamers over there. I guess they look like an equalizer. So he's probably looking at the people inside and so on. And so we ask, well, how does that relate to your idea of freedom? Well, when something happens that makes me feel not so free, I like to escape to my headphones. Which, if you saw my headphones, they're just about half the size of my head on each ear, and they block everything out. And that's my escape, music. It helps me to get into my own little world where it's just me. This is a very interesting collage, and a woman, a middle-class Euro-American woman. And I want to focus here on what she had to say about, in her discussion, which went on for about half an hour, of the image of the two people skinny dipping. It's my favorite picture, she said, and it's the one that she wants back. She keeps it on her refrigerator. This one I like because one of the things that makes me feel free the most is swimming in water. These people happen to be skinny dipping. That's phenomenal. If you can find a place that is so uninhibited and empty that you can happen to skinny dip, these days it's becoming rare. And so I asked, can you describe a picture for someone who wouldn't be able to see it? Sure, it's two young people jumping in and so on. When you're swimming and having, first there's just a lot of joy there, and when you're swimming in calm water like that, you can be just totally free. There's no gravity, there's no clothes inhibiting you, no other people around you in the picture. What could be disapproving? You're free to swim anywhere, move anywhere you want to move. And I'm assuming that the picture, she said, is not in New England. This is very much a woman's view of freedom, by the way. Not just the absence of inhibition. Note, the important thing to note here is the use of the body as a metaphor of freedom. Almost every one of the women use the body as a metaphor of freedom. And nudity in this case is used repeatedly. Almost none of the men we interviewed, and there are hundreds of hours of interviews, use the body in this way as a metaphor for freedom. I have more to say about that later on. The next case takes us to images of unfreedom, which of course is in many ways just as revealing. Before I get to this, I want to show you the feet up on the upper right-hand corner there in the pelvis, because that is this woman's view of freedom. Again, note the use of the body as a metaphor of freedom. And it evokes vacation, being away, and not being scheduled. Can relax, my body relaxes, I'm able to kind of lose attention and so on, clear my head. But what's more interesting is the metaphor of unfreedom, that picture up there of the naked woman. And what she said is I think, extremely revealing. It's about personal boundaries, she says. In many ways, what Americans say about unfreedom tells you far more about what freedom means than, in fact, the images of freedom itself. So she's saying it's about boundaries. You know, kind of the picture shows like a woman nude, and I would even say it almost seems that she doesn't want someone to see her naked. So I'd say, in that sense, she wants freedom to be private in her body. And so we ask, what do you mean by private in your body? Does that make sense? She says, just to have her body in herself. I'd say a sense of confidence, like a healthy sense of boundaries. What kind of boundaries? In the ZMED interview, you asked very obvious kind of questions, by the way. And asking very obvious questions results in very surprising answers. What kind of boundaries? Well, just knowing that you know that you won't be exposed, that other people will respect the boundaries that you set for yourself. So, I asked, why should people respect those boundaries? And she said, I would say that you're able to them to give them the same respect. I'd say you carry yourself through life in a particular way, and we all sort of have our personal space. And I'd say if you feel that's respected, then you don't feel interference from other people. You don't feel interference, we ask? Yeah. Or if you feel that other people are respecting your own personal space, it's easier to kind of just be on your own wisdom, I guess. And that's my idea of freedom. Very interesting. They said the strong emphasis here we see on the body and on personal space, on boundaries. It comes out over and over again among women interviewees. I want to turn to a middle-class white man. Again, the notions of unfreedom, which is, in this case, is far more revealing than the rather somewhat boring metaphors of freedom, which is the water and the ocean. The watch there, that's a very powerful image of the watch. It's a watch, he said, when we asked him to describe it, obviously showing the time. And so, what thoughts and feelings does this evoke about freedom? It actually makes me feel least free, because time seems to end a lot of things, the end of vacation, or the end of time together and responsibilities you have to do, end of a weekend, back to work, going for a walk, and then what you have to be, you have an appointment or you have to see someone, so that's it. It seems to restrict time and obviously restrict a lot of your freedom. Time restrict freedom? We ask. Right, I guess it can give you freedom too, but I see it as an end. You see it as an end? Yeah. And does it restrict you? We ask. Well, it's just that you have responsibilities. I mean, you have responsibilities You're out walking or enjoying yourself and you have an appointment that you have to go to. You may not want to go to, something that you have to deal with. You just can't do what you really want to do. It's just that you have responsibilities and you may not want to do this. Now, it's quite remarkable. The watch was used in a considerable number of times. And time, there's something about time which Americans find really powerfully restrictive, even though they find themselves very committed to it. So people, over and over, people say, I respect time. I respect being on time, but I hate it. And it becomes one of the most powerful feelings of metaphors, an expression of unfreedom. Even people, even especially among people who will say that I'm a fanatic about being on time. In fact, the more fanatical they claim they are, the more they tend to emphasize the watch and time. It comes up over and over as an emphasis on unfreedom. Why don't you look at the other image, because I got this a lot. The image up there of the man and the cartoon of a boss and an employee. This is a picture of what appears to be a boss talking to his employee, and the boss is about 3 times the size of the employee looking over a desk. It makes me feel least free. I look up on authoritarian figures, they dictate the way you should do things. And sometimes we don't feel like it, and so on. What's interesting here is that although Americans, as we now know from research done by several sociologists, are the most overworked people in the industrialized world. We work something like 30% more than Germans do, and we have less vacation than any other group of people. And the work site has become a site of unfreedom and relations with authority figures. Now, what's interesting is that I would have thought that this would be true of working class people, as is true, say, of the African American fellow I showed earlier, who also had a picture of his boss. But that was not the case. It goes all the way up to upper middle class people, consultants, or people earning over $150,000 a year, were talking about work and were very committed to their work and very much into their careers. Nonetheless, see it as a form of unfreedom. That really startled me, and you have to wonder what's going on. This is the whole nation feels as if it's unfree every time it goes to work. What happened to the Puritan ethic? It's still there, but it's sort of is fraught. This is, in fact, this same African American person, and the woman there on the left is his boss. I hope nobody knows it, because this is not an image from a magazine. Actually, he brought us a photograph. So his boss is a symbol, the greatest symbol of unfreedom. The picture is out of a Christmas party, and I'm recognizing my department administrator in his background. This is Christmas party and my boss. So how will you visually describe this? Okay, my boss is talking to another. She's a doctor. In the lab, we manage grants and so on. And they're just talking, okay? Everyone is just enjoying the Christmas party with the open bar. Okay, so, and how does this relate to your thoughts and feelings about being free and least free? Well, this is making me feel, is in the middle of a Christmas party here, not very free. This picture represents my non-freedom, my chains, my shackles, my glass ceiling. This is very sad, but it's, as I said, this is not someone working in a McDonald's or something like that. It's in our office. And there are numerous other images I wish I could share with you, but I don't have the time, because I just want to wrap up. The freedom is alive and well in America. It's powerfully institutionalized in the courts, in the press. Americans have a great commitment to it, unto death, as we see. I have many instances of that. People genuinely would rather choose death and not be free as they understand it. But it's been largely divorced from the political domain, except for an active 15%. Now, there's a lot of work I draw on here, which has been done by others, Newman and others, who've found that the formal freedom, which I talked about, our constitutional liberties and so on, they are alive. But they're kept alive, and a very active political process is taking place. But it's very much within the top 15% of the population, which is extremely articulate, which sort of, reads the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the think tanks and so on. America is replete with that. And they're the people who keep this system going and have a powerful tradition of discourse on it. But for the remaining 75% of the population, it's very much, I wouldn't say a dead issue or a non-issue, but a minor issue and something very much in the background. Formal constitutional liberties no longer have a powerful psychological support of our cherished notion of freedom. And this is very important. That is to say, this engagement, which is necessary, and which comes from this strong commitment which we've seen, which people have. People die for it. It's separated. Now, it's not that people have rejected it or opposed to it. And of course, when it's time for them to go to the courts, they go to the courts and they get their lawyers, as you know, we're among the most litigious people in the world. It's largely either taken for granted or forgotten. More important is removed from the semantic field of freedom. I have a diagram here to illustrate it. So the traditional triune view of freedom, which has existed from ancient times, is that freedom is a tripartite value. There's negative freedom, liberation from the power of others, not being under the control of another. Positive freedom to do things, to achieve one's desires, one's goals, to be in control, as we saw. And democracy, public freedom, power sharing. Sort of this Venn diagram sort of illustrate this, is the overlap of these. What's happened to America is what's on the right here, that in many ways the public aspect of freedom has been removed from the semantic field of what people consider freedom to be. It's there, they call it something else. In many ways, this has been the product of our own political history. Starting from the 19th century, of course, the liberal conception of freedom, a classic liberal conception of freedom, was very antagonistic towards the state. And for one of the things which liberalism, classic liberalism, sought to achieve and did achieve for as a period of time in the 19th century in America, was the assault on the state as the potential threat to one's liberty. And it was in the 19th century that the idea first emerged that there's a tension between liberty and government. This is a new idea. It wasn't true even of the founding fathers. It wasn't true of Jefferson, who emphasized active citizenship, who saw involvement with the state as important. The liberal conception then of the state being a bogeyman which threatens one's liberties, which thrived in 19th century Europe, but then lost out with the rise of the welfare state, in which people, the working classes and their unions, and strongly contested that idea, leading to the notion of freedom as something in which you participate in a state which is protective, in which you are engaged, and if you like, reintegrated that the cord, so to speak, which had been fragmented by the liberal assault on it, Well, that didn't happen in America for several reasons. That fragmenting of what I call the cord of freedom persisted for several reasons. One, the ideology of the minimal state, the idea of the state as a potential threat, was one factor. The rise of judicial review, which strongly sided with a conception of freedom which was hostile to state involvement, helped that along. And the constant emphasis on the fact that the state potentially is a threat to your pocketbook or whatever, actually I think eventually had its effect. The problem is that you can't condemn the state without implicitly condemning democracy, because democracy requires a state. It's just a fact. And it requires a state in which you're actively involved. It requires a state in which, when it works well, as citizens, you control that state. You actively participate in it. Participation becomes an end in itself, which is worthwhile, active citizenship. So to condemn the state is implicitly to assault the idea of democracy, and it's had its effect. Whatever the reasons, Americans have divorced democracy. Now, don't get me wrong, as I said. If you ask Americans if they like their democracy, they're going to tell you yes. Of course. Whenever, what I said, we've been talking for 2 hours about freedom, and you never once mentioned anything about democracy. Why is that? You never once. For 2 hours we've been sitting here talking about it. I mean, you can understand it with the surveys. Well, you sit down with someone for 2 hours, sometimes longer than 2 hours, going on about their images of freedom and so on, in-depth exploration. And at the end you say, you didn't say a word about voting, about your senator, about your congressman, about having this wonderful system of government with the separation of powers. What about the things you learn at school? What about, you write your congressman occasionally? Of course. I wouldn't want to live in Russia, and so on as a response. But what does this tell me is that it's been not hostile to democracy, but it's removed from their conception, their semantic field of what constitutes freedom. That's the important point here. I think that there are real dangers in this privatization, real dangers. The danger of political apathy, the emergence of plutocratic polity, the incumbency problem in congressional seats, threats to civil liberties, and internationally severely compromises America's role as a leader of the free world, an exemplar and promoter of freedom, which is a noble goal. I fully support the president in that desire. I'd love to see freedom all over the world, but we're very compromised. Let's look at each of these. Voter turnout. There's a program at Harvard by a namesake of mine, Patterson, called The Vanishing Voter. Let's look at this. We're supposed to be the leaders of the free world. And this is our turnout record. We're at the bottom of the heap. Maybe just a little behind Brazil, about equal to Brazil. That's extraordinary. That's been going on for some time, persists. Turnout, of course, is the proportion of people eligible to vote who do vote. It's different from, there are other indices which people use, which can give you a better picture. But this, I think, is the most significant one. The emerging plutocracy, campaign finance law without teeth. In fact, it's now being threatened in the courts, whatever little finance law we have, and the tremendous control of big money on our political system. The lobbyist scandal is right. You're all asleep if you aren't aware of this. Jack Abramoff, I noticed even in your local newspaper this morning has a story on Jack Abramoff. But he's just the tip of the iceberg. So it may well be a scandal that brings down the government. The White House is refusing to reveal photographs. I read this in the local newspaper this morning of President Bush with Abramoff. Why would one not want to reveal those photographs? Were they hugging each other? Were they in bed together, or what? It's the laws written by interest groups. They're meant to regulate. The classic case here is the Cheney group with the energy interests, who seem to have literally written that law. But again, this is just one of numerous examples. Increasingly, only the rich or those with access to great wealth can now contest senatorial seats. But not only a senatorial seat, by the way, is being mayor of New York. You need at least $10 million to run. This is really quite incredible. We're talking $20 million, $30 million to run a senatorial seat. I mean, who would even think about this? An ordinary man who's politically talented, just look at those figures and think, I can find better things to do with my time. And in a sense, a selection process takes place. Wealthy people who have made their fortune and who want to do something with their lives are likely to become involved with politics. There's incumbency crisis. This is the least addressed, but perhaps the most serious of the perils and threats to our democracy. What is it? Basically, I don't know if you know this, but there's no serious contest in the great majority of congressional seats now. They're pretty well fixed. In many cases, there isn't even an alarmingly increasing number of congressional seats aren't even contested, period. But more importantly, those which are so-called contested, they're not serious. And once you become a congressman, the chance of being unseated is remote, less than 10%. That's bad for democracy. There's no real contest in the system. The high cost of election, the powerful sway of special interests, whether through Gulf trips to Scotland or where have you. The 9/11 threat post 9/11 threat to civil liberties. The Patriot Act, which as I mentioned earlier, alarms even the Cato Institute. A group of middle-of-the-road lawyers brought out a report a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, called The New Normal. The term was actually taken from Cheney, who first used it, who claimed that there's a new normal now after 9/11. Traditionally, the way things worked in our free democratic system is that government was transparent and was completely exposed as much as possible. But the private life of citizens was completely protected and private. So there's minimal intrusion in the life of the individual and maximal intrusion and exposure of government, transparency, Freedom of Information Act, and so on. Now, the new normal is the complete reverse of this. What we have now is a system in which government is increasingly secretive, where we can't even get photographs of the president with someone. But there's increasing invasion of the privacy of individuals, a complete turnaround. Now, what's especially alarming about this is that Americans don't seem to mind. There's a report just last week of a survey in the Times in which a majority of Americans claim that it's okay if the objective is to get the bad guys. If you leave out the second part of the statement, is it okay for the government to spy on people locally? People say, no, we don't like that. But if you're spying for the bad guys, it's okay. Well, how do you know? How do you spy for the bad guys without spying on everyone? The increased use of wiretaps, access to private medical, library records, and other records. Freedom of expression, the press threatened, jailing of journalists. Just again, the headlines just 2 days ago, the censoring of a senior NASA scientist, What did he do? He expressed some concern about global warming. The government was alarmed. And all the administrators at NASA were alarmed. And in fact, insisted that from now on, he reported to the press officer before making any scientific comment about global warming. This is America. This is America. This is not Russia. This is not some Asian sort of Republican, post-Soviet country. This is America. Illegal assaults on habeas corpus. International claims are compromised. America's noble claim to promote freedom globally has been severely compromised, not only by our foreign policy, but by the discrepancy between our former liberties and our practice of democracy. One is reminded of Ed Mora, on whom a fine film was just made, who once said that we cannot defend freedom abroad by destroying it at home. And especially the discrepancy between our formal constitutional expression of freedom and ordinary freedom by which we live. I'm suggesting that the privatization of freedom is a good part of this problem. I attribute not all, but a good part of it to this. There's either indifference to our constitutional liberties and practices, or they're recklessly taken for granted. Let me give you a quote from FDR, which I think is pertinent. The only sure bulwark of continuing liberty is a government strong enough to protect the interests of the people, and a people strong enough and well enough informed to maintain the sovereign control over the government. And the idea that our safety requires surrender of our liberties is an abomination. One of my favorite 18th century figures had something to say about this, Ben Franklin, who said that they that give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. So my conclusion is that the greatest danger is that the practice of all freedom requires great vigilance and active citizenship. The greatest irony is that our very privatized conception of freedom paves the ground for the condition that may result in their erosion. Let me quote again, this time in closing, from Thomas Paine, one of the great sort of founders of, intellectual founders of our constitutional heritage, that public freedom, which is, I think, under threat from our very lethargy or indifference and the very privatized view of freedom which we have. Those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must, like men, undergo the fatigue of supporting it and taking it for granted. As we do so, being indifferent to that formal freedom is the greatest danger we face. And however much, however strong our commitment to private freedom, we've got to understand that we're at the point now, we're at the threshold of losing a good part of that public freedom we cherish, but in losing that, we lose this very private freedom by which we live, and which Americans, more than any other group of people, cherish so much. Thank you.
Time for some questions and comments. Please be very brief. There are two microphones, please. Approach the microphone, identify yourself, and ask a question or make a comment. questions or comments?
Yeah, I've got a question.
Okay, go ahead.
In my really limited experience of the political world, it seems like a lot of what makes people opinionated or outraged or puts them in a position to affect their culture and society and government is media, and that's becoming increasingly, corporatized. And I was wondering what you had to say about that, and if you saw any bright light for that in the future.
The media? It's easy to blame the media. Sorry, let me go back here. It's too easy to blame the media. I think the media remains one of the last bright spots, no, not last, that's two or three, but one of the persisting bright spots in American tradition of formal freedom. We still have a great press, maybe better than any other country. Now, one of the interesting things about America is that we have some of the best press in the world and some of the worst. And the Europhiles love to cite the BBC and all. I lived in Britain for a long time and so on. And I mean, it's, yeah, the BBC is good. But I mean, America offers choices at the BBC level to a much greater degree. I mean, whether it's the Wall Street Journal, if you're on the right, or the New York Times, or any number of the Los Angeles Times, the Atlanta Constitution, there are really great, there's a vast number of really great newspapers still in this country, and it's one of the things, one of the main bulwarks of our freedom. Now, we do have the Fox Channel, and we do have media that are blatantly biased and so on, but you don't have to listen to them if you're not interested. And we do have the conservative talk shows. Nothing stopping anyone from having liberal talk shows, although it seems that it's in the nature of liberalism that it doesn't seem to like talk shows. So no, I can't agree with that. I mean, I'd say that when I get a little bit depressed about this privatized view of freedom and the loss of the apathy, the voting record, and so on, it's the press that sort of lifts my spirit. I still think we have in America the greatest press in the world. And I may be wrong, I may be duly optimistic, but that's my judgment.
I have a question that concerns sort of our new foreign policy of spreading freedom. Reading recently about the idea of the concept of spreading freedom to Iraq, where we go and we say deliver freedom, but you have people that have never experienced, some have never experienced freedom in their lives or never been able to sort of even act on it. So we deliver this sort of concept of freedom to people, but yet they don't know how to act on it individually or as a community or as a society. And I was wondering your thoughts on that and how, maybe in a timeline, how can a society of people within a year develop that and react on it, or does that take generations, or how would that work?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. I'm glad you asked it, because it refers to part of an ongoing controversy which I've engaged with many of my colleagues. And the basic assumption of the Bush policy is one which is shared, in this respect it's shared by almost all political scientists and political philosophers. It's what I call the universalist view of freedom. It's the assumption that everyone wants to be free, and every society inherently cherishes freedom, that freedom is not something which is constructed, but that it's there, it's written in the hearts of men and women. And therefore, if freedom doesn't exist in a particular society, you can assume that it's because of bad institutions, because of bad people like Saddam, bad leaders, and that all you have to do is to remove these constraints, and the natural desire for freedom will assert itself. And this is clearly articulated in the defense of our reasons for going to war. I mean, for invading Iraq, get rid of Saddam, and Iraqis would all come and shower our soldiers with garlands and wonderful things and so on. And I guess some people really believe that. And the neoconservatives, I know some of them, I think really believe that. And it's, and they were wrong. But it's very important to note that they have the whole weight of much of political theory and political science behind them. The alternative view is that freedom is not something inherent, and it is not true that people necessarily want freedom and will grasp it if you just remove the constraints on them. And the simple explanation for that is that if that were true, a far greater number of countries should have been free over the thousands of years that societies existed. And why is it that it's existed primarily in the West? And my argument is that freedom is a socially constructed concept and culture, and something that emerged in the West for a very peculiar set of reasons. And we cannot assume that other cultures will simply want it. Now, I get into a lot of trouble at this point, and I very easily am classed with a lot of very unsavory bedfellows. Most notably, a group, the Chinese, and a group of countries which issued in 1993 something called the Bangkok Declaration, which is the culmination of arguments concerning whether Asia should become free like the rest of, like the West. And there was a conference held by the United Nations in 1993 for re-energizing and re-signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Chinese met with a strange group of countries. I mean, Iran, Singapore, Indonesia, several other Asian countries emphasized what they called Asian values and argued that they don't have a tradition of freedom. And this is a Western thing. They could almost have said, well, Patterson is right. Fortunately, they didn't drag me into that. But my colleagues have dragged me into this and said, well, you see what you've done. You're supporting this position. Well, I'm not supporting it, but it happens to be true. Now, what then, if my position is correct, and I happen to think it's correct, most countries don't even have a word for freedom in their language before encounter with the West. If my position is correct, the question then is, how do you achieve what I accept as a noble goal of spreading freedom? And the way to do it is not to do it at the point of a gun. By assuming that going in with your guns and blasting away and removing Saddam and pulling him out of his hole and so on, that you're going to get freedom, because it's not happened. They're killing Americans. They're now beginning to kill our journalists. The only way to do it is to negotiate it, is by persuasion. Freedom in that sense is a culture. It's like Christianity or it's like Islam or in a religion. You don't sort of impose your religion at the point of a gun. You try to persuade people that this is a better way. It may not be perfect, but it's a better way. And you do this by negotiation, and you assume that it's going to take time, and you assume that in the course of development that these other cultures are going to adapt freedom in ways that may seem strange sometimes, but in which there are variations, because even right now there are significant variations even within the West. You know, the British system of parliamentary democracy would be considered by the American Supreme Court an abomination. Parliament has absolute power. There are there are room for variation even within the West, and I think ultimately what we will see, my optimistic scenario, is a glorious spread of freedom eventually. But we can expect that it's going to be adapted to the cultures of these other countries. Now, there are limits to which this can be done. I have certain basic bedrock, bottom line positions about what constitutes freedom, certain basic rights and so on. But I think that in the same way that there can be significant variations, as there is between Sweden and France and America, the conception of freedom, that we can see a flowering of freedom eventually. Through persuasion, through negotiations, through international treaties, which will be the right way to do it. We're going about it now in exactly the wrong way. We have expressed total disdain for international treaties. We have a contempt for people's local cultures, and we've begun the process by sort of trying to introduce democracy and freedom at the point of a gun in Iraq, just the completely wrong way. So the bottom line is, yes, I do think that freedom is not inherent. I do think that most cultures do not have a tradition of freedom, but I do think that we should pursue that policy, but in a way which involves persuasion and negotiation rather than by force.
Hi, Professor Patterson. My name is Lenny Tagaki, and I teach in the English department. I have a situation that immigrants hold a very tenuous position, and in terms of mobility, crossing borders and even moving in places within the U.S. And I was interested in that regard, mainly because, in terms of the immigrant as perhaps conceptualizing freedom or values or human rights in a way that they would be bringing from their country of origin, and it would be, of course, transfigured and transformed by the discourse of freedom in the United States. So I was interested, in talking about this idea of the citizen and the immigrant, a kind of subcategory of the racial categories that you had brought up earlier in your analyses. In terms of the ZMET studies, did you find that there were any sorts of trends in how immigrant populations or how parts of your pool of interviewees had a self-conception or a conception of freedom?
Yes.
In that way?
I've done, actually, unfortunately, none of the ZMET interviews were with foreigners, but the more conventional interviews I did before I got into this technique did do a lot of interviews with people from foreign countries, from Mexico, from Korea, and from elsewhere. And it also came out clearly in the survey that people from these countries which lacked freedom obviously see in America, what's most important to them is that, you can vote, my God. Ironically, very often, as you just pointed out, they are the ones which aren't allowed to vote. So one of the seeming paradox in the survey results, which I didn't show, is that although the West seemed to have this very high proportion of people who cite civil liberties as important, when you look at the proportion of vote, it's very low. That's because they aren't allowed to vote. But of course, we're most aware of and acutely conscious of liberty when it's absent. And people are coming from Mexico or from even more authoritarian societies are very, very, very conscious of America as a free country and under formal liberties, that they can, go to the courts and that they can eventually vote. And this is one of the things which they look forward to most as soon as they get their citizenship papers signed. And I expect that, so I see this as a wonderful development, and would think that it would be a very good thing for our democracy if they in fact are incorporated and are allowed to vote, which means in fact being made into citizens. So that's one other interesting thing I noted, by the way, among the people I did interview, is that the only time that Americans go on at length about American freedom is when they're making contrast with foreign countries. People, for example, many of the interviews will say that when I traveled to Burma, I realized how free I was and how important the democracy is because I saw what happens when it's not there. And over again. In fact, this is true even of people who do not travel. They'll say that I saw a show on television the other night about some country or the other, and it's made me sort of realize how fortunate I am to live in America, and I suddenly recognize its significance. So they no longer take it for granted. So that does come out in a significant way. But absolutely, I mean, immigrants of all groups, and the more authoritarian the country they come from, the more they cherish these formal liberties.
I was struck by what you were saying about people conceiving of time as a constraint on their freedom, and also tied into this people's lack of political participation, because of course being an informed citizen and knowing what your government is up to is a time-intensive activity, particularly if you want to pay attention to it at the level at which policy actually gets made, which is sort of deep within the administrative branches and sort of like the machinations of city government, things like this. So I'm wondering, given that and what you were saying about plutocracy and sort of how interests write bills and how difficult it is to unseat an incumbent, might it sort of be rational utility maximizing behavior to disregard government and seek your pleasure elsewhere?
There are a rational choice there, is rational choice theory, and it's not one of my favorite aspects of social philosophy. I mean, I don't agree with it. Actually falls precisely on the fact that people do vote. From a rational choice point of view, nobody should vote. It doesn't make any sense. And we know that in many countries, high percentage of people vote. But your point about time, I'm glad you raised it, because that came as a real surprise to me in the study. Over and over again. I mean, in fact, I might spend a whole chapter in the book I'm writing on this business of time, because I had just assumed that Americans cherish time, that they see it as something valuable, and I'd assumed that Americans like to work, and that work is a form of self-realization. And it certainly is to some people. But when I began to get this with upper middle class people who would say things like, I know you think my job looks like a glamorous job, but like one woman was the head of a consulting team in a Fortune 20 company. Said that, I spend a lot of my time buying houses and redesigning them, because I find that a way of getting away from the job, which I really don't like very much. And it's not that people don't want to spend time doing things then. It's time in relation to work, which people find that it pulls both ways. This is the problem, I think, especially with the upper middle class people, because they have to value time. It's a precious commodity. So they've got instilled in their mind that you be on time, you meet your deadlines. If you tell a client that you're going to provide this report at 8 o'clock on Monday, you do it, even if it means being up for 20 hours a night. So this is absolutely an essential part of their being. But they hate it. And they feel that, it sort of imposes it's like an internal chain on them. But it's not that they don't like to do things. I mean, they love to spend their time. I mean, this woman is very typical. She spends an enormous amount of all her free time doing up, redecorating, buying places and redecorating it. And they spend their time. I'm just amazed at the number of upper middle class Americans who do charitable work, and this is a very moving aspect of it. I mean, this is a young woman in their 30s who somehow find the time to do it, and they don't see that as an unfreedom. In fact, the terms they then use is that this time spent is very fulfilling. So I've never felt this way, by the way, and sort of as an academic, I enjoy the time I spend on my work. But something is up here, which, as I said, took me by surprise. And over and over again, these sort of quite prosperous Americans sort of thrusting images of the clock at me and saying this is their symbol of unfreedom. And it really is fascinating. But no, if you see politics, and to get back to the rats, if you see the problem with the rats, the rational choice theorists, is that they see politics in purely instrumental terms. And if you do that, you're not going to vote. My vote is 1/1,000,000th of a vote. But if you see it as participation, that is something you do because you enjoy it. Now, I know a lot about another country in which I was, as the chairman kindly noted, special advisor to a prime minister for 8 years, Michael Manley. And I'm very intimately acquainted with that political system too. And there is a poor country in which over 80% of people are voting. Now, they also know that the instrumental effects are minimal. We've had a democracy now for 40 years. They've thrown government out, thrown government back in, and it's not done very much for them. But they still vote. And I've asked them why they do it. They do it because they enjoy it. The act of participation itself becomes an end in itself. And that's why I vote. This is my civic duty. And I feel good about voting. And I never think that, oh my God, there are 80 million other voters and I'm only going to have 180 millionth of an effect. Not only a rational choice theorist would think that, human beings think that way. I don't think anyone does. And the problem is how to get people back into thinking that participation is important. And the one optimistic thing about the history of voting is that it has ups and downs. The studies have shown that there have been periods of high voter turnout. For example, during the Jacksonian period, right up to the the Civil War or so, and then there was a decline. Then, of course, there was a tremendous increase. We had a huge period of increased voter turnout between the 30s, the Roosevelt reform, and the 60s. And we're now in a downturn from the 70s, especially after 73 and Nixon, of a decline. So what goes up and what goes down and what goes up and what goes down will go up again. I mean, so for the long view of history, I mean, it's encouraging. I don't see many signs, but I have no reason to believe that looking at America somewhere in the 20s, where there's enormous decline, huge demobilization in the early part of this century. Of course, in the South, people were just completely about between a third and almost 40% of the population, mainly black, but also poor whites, were simply disenfranchised by various poll tax laws and various other things. Tremendous decline in voting. So, the fact that it's gone up and down gives me some promise, some hope that maybe it will go up again.
On that note, we come to the end of this lecture series. I'd like to suggest that if you have any more questions or comments, to please see Professor Patterson outside. He will be signing his book, and of course, buy his book also. Let me take this opportunity to thank you all for taking time to come. And it's been a busy day. It's also been, very, busy day for Professor Patterson. And we don't want to, this is Montana, we are very generous, we are very kind. And we don't want to leave you with that impression that we walked him to death. So Patterson, thank you. In fact, learned a lot, and I hope you also did. Please give me.
Thank you very much.